Welcome to the Discover Alaska Lecture Series, brought to you by the University of Alaska's Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning. My name is Althea St. Martin, and I will be your host for this summer's series. Discover Alaska is in its 15th season and was held on the UAF campus in past summers. The COVID-19 pandemic and social distancing guidelines required that we rethink the format for the series this summer. We are delighted that KUAC has agreed to support this new format as a weekly TV broadcast. Thank you, KUAC. Each Wednesday night over the course of the summer, KUAC will air a talk by a local community member on a range of Alaskan topics. We are grateful to our speakers who were incredibly flexible in adjusting to this new format and appreciate the time they are donating to help us all learn more about our great state. But before I introduce tonight's speaker, I wanted to let you know that you can view and share the talks online later by going to UAF Summer Sessions website at uaf.edu/summer/events. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Tim Mowry, who will present behind the scenes of wildland fire suppression in Alaska. Mr. Mowry is the statewide public officer for the Alaska Division of Forestry's Wildland Fire and Aviation Program. He will cover a broad range of topics, including wildlife fire suppression, who's responsible, how it's done, and Alaska's wildfire history, including the impact of climate change on wildfire in Alaska. Thank you, Tim, for providing such a complete view of Alaska's wildland fires and the state's suppression efforts for Discover Alaska.
Okay, my name is Tim Mowry, and I am the Public Information Officer for the Alaska Division of Forestry Wildland Fire and Aviation Program. And today I was asked to come speak about fire management in Alaska, how it works, what's involved, and just a little bit of history and just how we deal with wildfires in Alaska. And wildfires in Alaska, it's a natural part of the ecosystem here in the boreal forest. The boreal forest is a fire-driven landscape. It needs fire to rejuvenate and to stay fresh and invigorated. So fire is a natural part of the landscape here in the Alaska, as I'm sure anybody who has lived here for any duration of time, especially last year, knows by now. And of course, fire seasons vary widely, from year to year. So last year was a very busy season, preceded by 3 years that were not so busy. But so today I'm just going to run you through a little bit of how things work, and I'll be bouncing around through this PowerPoint as we go. But Division of Forestry's role in fire management, our mission is to protect human life and property. We call them values at risk, and they could be homes, they could be roads, they could be power lines, infrastructure, anything like that. And so that's what we do. We try to protect Alaskans from wildfire. And we try to do it in as safe a way as possible. Safety, as anybody in the fire world knows, is the number one priority. Safety of the public, safety of the firefighters. Everything is based on keeping the public and our firefighters safe. We're not going to engage in something that is going to put anybody at risk. We deal with mitigating risk. That's our job. We come in and assess the risk and try to figure out ways to mitigate it, whether that be through suppression or monitoring or what have you. And we do have statutory authority to do that. I won't go too much into that, but fire season in Alaska officially by statute starts on April 1st and runs through August 31st. That is when people need to have a small or large scale burn permit to do any debris burning. If you want to burn brush piles, or if you want to use a burn barrel, if you want to have a bonfire, you need to have a burn permit. If you want to have a campfire that's less than 3 feet in diameter and flame lengths less than 2 feet high, that's what the regulations say, you do not need to have a permit. So we get a lot of questions about that, but if you're going to do any brush burning or use a burn barrel in Alaska, you need to have a Division of Forestry burn permit, and those are free. You can get them at your local forestry offices, or you can get them online at forestry.gov, forestry.alaska.gov/burn. And if you just Google Division of Forestry burn permit, you will be taken to a site where you can print one offline, sign it, keep it, and you're good to go. And in Alaska, it's a very interagency effort in terms of wildland fire management. Everything is based on the Alaska Interagency Wildfire Management Plan. And when I say interagency, that pretty much encompasses the Division of Forestry, the BLM Alaska Fire Service, and the U.S. Forest Service. Those are the three main players in wildfire suppression in Alaska. And really the two main players are the Division of Forestry and BLM Alaska Fire Service. The Forest Service is a much bigger player in the lower 48. In Alaska, the Forest Service, their two national forests are the Tongass, which is a rainforest, and the Chugach, which is a coastal forest, and so they do not get that much fire activity because of their locations and the temperate climates. So this interagency management plan is unique to Alaska. Other states don't really have that. And what it does is it lays out how we manage fires in Alaska, how we prioritize the management of fires, and who responds, how we respond, and as I said, it's a very interagency thing. We share the load, so to speak. And this map will show you that where the BLM Alaska Fire Service protection area is. That's mainly in rural Alaska. They deal with most of the northern half of the state, and which includes a lot of the bush and rural Alaska. Division of Forestry, we deal with most of the roaded system in the state. So your big population centers, Anchorage, the Mat-Su Valley, the Kenai Peninsula, Fairbanks, North Star Borough, that's our responsibility. And the U.S. Forest Service, they pretty much handle Southeast Alaska, and then they also oversee protection in the northern panhandle there, where Skagway and Haines and that. So, and I think it breaks down to about 152 point something million acres for the Division of Forestry. I think it's about 193 million acres for the BLM Alaska Fire Service, and I believe it's 27 million acres for the U.S. Forest Service. So huge chunk of real estate to try to offer wildland fire protection to. And it's a massive state, and that really makes it a challenge. And as you can see on this other map, the Alaska land ownership map, that's another challenge is there are a lot of different landowners and land managers in Alaska. And when there is a fire that occurs, that land manager is the jurisdictional agency. That's who we will be working for. That's who will dictate what kind of action they want taken on a fire that's on their land. And so we basically work for them, and it may be the BLM, it may be the State Department of Natural Resources, U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Fish and Wildlife Service, and we deal with a lot of Native corporations are another big landowner here. So we deal with all sorts of different agencies and try to do what they want us to do to manage that fire on their landscape. And here this splits it up a little bit more. It shows you where the AFS zones are in yellow and the Division of Forestry protection areas are in blue, and this is green. And we have 7 area offices scattered around the state for the Division of Forestry. And each one of those stations, Anchorage, Fairbanks, Delta, Tok, Copper River, Kenai, and the southwest area, which is based in McGrath. And each one of those stations has a firefighting force, so to speak. Personnel there that respond to initial attack to fires and within their certain area, and that's how things are split up. So once again, I said it's a huge landscape. And a lot of how we manage fire in Alaska is based on what we call fire management options. The state is split up, we've gone through as interagency partners and split up all the land in Alaska and into 4 management options: critical, full, modified, and limited. And as you could probably guess by their names sort of explain what they are. Critical, are fires, land very in your real densely populated areas. So your Kenai Peninsula, Anchorage, Fairbanks, and to the lesser degree, some of your smaller communities. But wherever you really have a community, you're going to be in full or critical. And what that means is we're going to respond to those fires. We're going to initial attack those fires as soon as we find out about them, to keep them as small as possible and to keep them from becoming a threat, because they have been identified as critical or full because of the values at risk in and around those areas. So it may be a community, it may be a city, it may be any number of things, a power plant, the pipeline, anything like that. Modified and limited, as you can see, and this sort of describes Alaska, a limited protection area is one that it's probably not going to receive attention, a fire, because there are no threats really in that area, and that's why we've designated it as limited protection. So a lot of times we will, if a fire starts in a limited or modified protection area, depending on what's out there, we'll let those fires burn and monitor them, because it is not cost effective to put them out and they are not posing a risk. And as I mentioned before, wildfire is a natural part of the Alaska ecosystem and landscape. So we view fire as can be a good thing from a management perspective. It enhances wildlife habitat. Like I said before, it rejuvenates the forest and keeps it young and is in a successional stage. And so we recognize that we do need fire on the landscape to maintain a healthy ecosystem. That said, there are times in the limited areas where we will take some action because, say, we see a fire early in the season, we can put it out, and we think that if we don't put it out, that fire could become sort of a nuisance for the rest of the summer by putting up smoke. And if it's anywhere close to a community, it could smoke in that community for all summer, and we know people don't like that. So there are instances, we call them non-standard responses, where we could respond to a fire limited. But for the most part, if a fire is unlimited, we're gonna identify it, see where it is, and monitor it on a regular basis to see if it is going to pose a threat. And there are instances where there are cabins or allotments or other structures in a limited area, and what we would do then is we'd do possible site protection, where we would send firefighters out to cut a fire line around a native allotment because they are deemed we have to protect them according to federal regulations. So we may cut a fire line around an allotment. We may go out and set up sprinklers around a cabin or an archaeological site to try to protect that site from the fire. But we're not going to take direct suppression on the fire. We're going to protect a site within that fire for whatever reason. Like I said, it could be a cabin, it could be an archaeological site, it could be a native allotment. But that's really what when we identify a fire is reported, the first thing that's done is to see what management option is it in. Is it in critical, full, modified, or limited? And then the next thing is going to be who's the landowner, and we will notify the landowner and get direction from them on how they want us to proceed. And sort of the organization that oversees all of this is the Alaska Interagency Coordination Center. And that is based at Fort Wainwright in Fairbanks. It is referred to as the GAC, Geographic Area Coordination Center. There are 10 GACs in the United States, one of which is Alaska. We've got our own GAC because of the size and remoteness of Alaska, and the others are spread around the lower 48. And what the AICC, as we call it, does is they're the focal point for initial attack resource coordination, logistical support, and resource mobilization. So when we get a fire, the AICC sort of coordinates all the resources that are going to that fire, in terms of personnel, supplies. They have their own predictive services desk, so they have meteorologists there that do daily weather briefings and provide spot weather forecasts, and they have fire behavior analysts that provide information on how fires, they can model fires and determine how big they're going to grow, where they're predicted to grow over the course of, over the next days, weeks, based on weather, based on fuel models, and all of that goes into, determining how you are going to manage a fire. If there are natural barriers that can be used to slow the spread of that fire, if there are, water bodies nearby. And so the AICC sort of coordinates this on a national level, and they are in touch with the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho, which is where wildland firefighting in the U.S. is really based out of. The NIFC, as it's called, is the overarching organization that oversees all the GACs. So it's very complicated. It's sort of like a military operation, but it's that way for a reason, because it is such a monumental task. Not just in Alaska, but across the U.S., especially the western U.S., where you have to determine what resources you have to send to a fire, what fires are the highest priority, because a lot of times we're competing with other GACs for resources for fires, and that's always going to come down to life and property is the biggest priority. So that national organization, they have groups within that organization that are looking at the fire situation daily, and they help prioritize where resources are going. Alaska relies very, very heavily on lower 48 support, because we are such a big state, and we do not have nearly enough resources in an active fire year to deal with what will be handed to us by Mother Nature. And so we reach out to the lower 48 an awful lot in a busy year. Last year was a very busy year, and we brought up more than 5,000 personnel from the lower 48 to help us, including, and I'll get into that here in a bit, but including over 120 crews, 20-person crews were brought up here. And we were very fortunate that it was a slow season in the lower 48, and there wasn't much competition for those resources. So we were basically able to get all the resources we needed to deal with last year's fire season. And here you can see our 10 largest fire seasons on record dating back to 1939. And anybody who's been here for 20 years or so will remember 2004. Burned almost 6.6 million acres. It was a very smoky summer, and that still holds the place as number one in terms of acreage burned. And you'll see 2019 did not make it on here. It was actually one off. It was 11th. So we burned almost 2.6 million acres last year. But as you'll see, number one is 2004, number two is 2015, number 5 is 2005, and number 10 is 2009. So 4 of the largest 10 fire seasons, and since dating back to 1939, have occurred since 2005, which is, a lot of people are focused on climate change right now, and a lot of people want to attribute that to climate change. We at the Division of Forestry are not climate change experts. That's not what we do, but we have noticed a trend towards earlier and larger fire seasons. And I think this graphic really illustrates that. And especially when you throw in 2019, you would have, you'd have 5 of the top 11 fire seasons since 2005. But as you can see, Alaska can burn a great deal of land. in a season. And so just a little bit about last year's season, 719 total fires, which I think was the 8th largest number of fires dating back to 1939. Almost 2.6 million acres, the 11th largest fire season on record. And this was interesting, and this is usually the case. 347 human-caused fires, and they burned almost 45,000 acres. And then 372 lightning-caused fires for over 2.5 million acres. And what's typical is we burn, our lightning-caused fires are typically much larger than our human-caused fires because those are a lot of those fires in limited protection. They're in remote areas, they're started by lightning, and they go into a monitor status because they're not posing a threat. It's not cost effective to try to put them out. You're posing a risk to the people that are trying to do it. So I don't think there's ever been a season where we've had more. Well, I take that back. I think there have been, but those are low fire seasons. But typically we have a much more acreage burned in lightning-caused fires than we do human-caused fires, and which makes sense. The human-caused fires are typically fires around residential, urban areas where your people are congregated, and their initial attack, they're caught. There's a lot of resources available. So we can go after those fires, and they don't get as big as a fire that's allowed to burn for 1 or 2 or 3 months, which just keeps chunking away. But we don't typically have more lightning-caused fires than human-caused fires. So last year was an anomaly in that respect. Typically we have a lot more, I think over the last 20 years, 60% of our fires in the state have been human-caused. So we typically have more human-caused fires than lightning-caused fires, especially in Division of Forestry protection areas, which are along that roaded system where most of the people are located. And last year, as this picture illustrates, that picture is of the McKinley fire, sort of the aftermath down near Willow. It was a devastating fire, and it contributed to make last year the second most destructive fire season on record, behind 1996, and people that have been here for a while may recall the Miller's Reach fire down in Big Lake that burned over 300 structures. But there were 158 structures destroyed in wildfires last year, and 59 of those were primary residences or homes. And most of those were burned in that McKinley fire in Willow. And that fire was unique in that it started in mid-August, and typically fire season in the south central portion of the state, south of the Alaska Range, usually ends mid-June to early July. They start getting moisture come in, and so it was real rare for a fire to occur that late in the season down there. But last year was a very rare season here. It was one of the driest, if not the driest season on record. Fires burned very deep, very long. The fires were burning 2 to 3 feet down deep into the soil, causing all sorts of problems, ash pits, that were 2 feet deep, and things that we don't typically see up here. What you often hear that fires in Alaska, the term that you'll hear is extremely resistant to control. And that's because they get down into that peat and that moss and tundra, and it's really hard to put them out. You got to dig them up, you got to hose them down, you got to get down to where the heat is, and that's why we have fires that will overwinter for the entire winter. They'll get down into some peat and they'll stay there, and they'll smolder all winter long. The snow falls, but it insulates those fires. And the next spring, when that snow melts on a nice, hot, dry, windy day, it's not uncommon to have fires from the year before pop up again. They don't usually present much of a risk or a threat because they're in an area that's already burned. But it does show you the resilience of fire, and that it can endure an Alaska winter such as the one we had last year, which is a very cold, snowy winter, and they can come back to life. And a new term that I've heard tossed around recently is zombie fires. We've always called them holdover fires, but somebody has coined the term zombie fires because they refuse to die. And so I thought that was ironic. But that McKinley fire down near Willow was one of the big fires last year. as was the Swan Lake fire down in the Kenai Peninsula. That burned, I think it started June 5th and it burned into October. Very unusual down there, 170,000 acres. Shut down the Sterling Highway, the only road between Anchorage and Kenai. Same with this McKinley fire. It shut down the Parks Highway for good chunks of time, the only road between Fairbanks and Anchorage, unless you drive around the Richardson. So those are the kind of challenges that we're faced with in Alaska, because these fires can, if they shut down a road like that, in the lower 48, there's usually a way around. But up here, there may not be a way around, and if it is, it's a long way around. So we try to do everything we can to keep road corridors open and such things like that. But some of these fires on the road system can really wreak havoc, both from an Alaskan's point of view and from a tourist point of view. Traffic was shut off to the Kenai last year for a good chunk of the time, and that really impacted their economy down there and just their supply line for food, for supplies from Anchorage to the Kenai Peninsula. So that's something that you always have to take into consideration. And last year was the 15th time that we've broken the 2 million acre mark for acres burned. And as I noted, we did bring up more than 5,000 people from the lower 48 and even Puerto Rico. The only state that did not have any personnel up here was Connecticut. Brought up a total of 145 crews. Those are about 20-person crews. And some of those crews made 2 trips to Alaska last year. We also brought up more than a dozen incident management teams. And an incident management team is a group of high-level, highly qualified fire managers who are brought in to manage a fire, and they are the ones that determine what kind of actions to take, working with the landowner, and what resources are needed. And there are, I believe there are 15 or 16 Type 1 incident management teams in the country. We have one in Alaska, and we use that. We have 2 Type 2 teams, and we can make 1 Type 1 team out of that. And but we deployed, 19 fires had incident management teams on them last year, or 19 IMTs responded to fires. Some of those fires, like the Swan Lake fire, I think had 8 IMTs over the course of the summer because of the duration of the event. And typically, when somebody comes up from the lower 48, whether it's an IMT or a crew or a single resource, they will do a 2-week assignment. It's a 14-day assignment, and they may have the option to extend for another week, but typically it does not last more than 21 days. And after 21 days, you're required to take at least 1 day off to reset your clock and to try to maintain some kind of work-rest ratio. And last year we had, there were at least a dozen fires that had evacuations associated with them. One in Fairbanks, the Shovel Creek fire up by Murphy Dome that I'm sure people here remember. The picture on the screen, that is the first stages of the McKinley fire, I believe on the 2nd day when it shut down the Parks Highway. And there were a couple other fires, the Montana Creek and Malaspina fires down in the valley. But a lot of these, and the Rainy Pass fire was interesting because that is a checkpoint on the Iditarod Trail sled dog race. Pretty remote checkpoint. There's a lodge there and some cabins, but I believe there were some Boy Scouts there, and a fire came close to the lodge that night, and so they brought in the National Guard to fly out, I think, 26 people because they were worried about that fire. Everything worked out fine, but in terms of evacuations, that's a worst case scenario. We don't want to have to tell people to leave their homes, and we can't tell people to leave their homes. We can suggest it, recommend it, and as you can imagine, in Alaska, a lot of people choose to stay and try to protect their homes. And so we just try to give them the best information that we possibly can as to what risk is involved. And but an evacuation is something that is nobody enjoys doing that. And moving on to so what kind of resources do we have in Alaska to fight fires? Well, like I said, we've got our area offices in these different places. So Matsu and McGrath are actually two different areas, but they are managed as one. But those are where, Matsu and McGrath, Kenai, Kodiak, which is actually in Soldotna, Tok, Delta, Fairbanks, and Valdez Copper River, which is based in Glen Allen. And as I said, it's a really interagency effort up here. So in terms of crews, we have 3 hotshot crews. They are sort of the elite level hand crews, Type 1 crews. Pioneer Peak, which is a division of Forestry resource, and the Chinas and Midnight Suns, which are BLM AFS hotshot crews. We have 5 Type 2 IA crews, which are a step below hotshot crews, and all these are 20 to 22 person crews. Gannett Glacier and White Mountain, which are division of Forestry. Yukon and Tanana Chiefs are organized by Chugach Mute and Tanana Chiefs Conference, which are native corporations that have sponsored crews. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a Type 2 IA crew. And we also have 2 agency sort of Type 2 training crews. Type 2 would be a step below Type 2 IA, and they typically don't do initial attack. They're more of a mop-up crew, and one of those is at the BLM Alaska Fire Service, the North Star crew, and the other one is right here at UAF. UAF for the last 4 or 5 years has had a fire crew, a Type 2 crew, as part of its fire science program, and it's sponsored by the Division of Forestry, and it has turned into a really highly sought after crew. They do really good work, and a lot of these crew members have gone on to become members of some of these other crews as they climb up the ladder. So we're really appreciative of that. And if you are a UAF student and you're looking for summer work, it's a great option. You get in good shape, I can tell you that, and you stand a chance of making some good money if it's a busy fire season, and you'll build friendships that you'll maintain for the rest of your life. And we also have what we call EFF Type 2 crews, and a lot of times these are coming based out of rural villages in Alaska, as well as your urban centers. Fairbanks has 2 Type 2 crews. I believe Delta has 1, Matsu has 1, but a lot of them come out of the villages, and we used to have over 70 of these crews in Alaska, and now we're down to about a dozen because there's just not as much demand for that firefighting jobs as there used to be. People have other jobs that they can get. It's hard work, and it's not guaranteed work. If it's a slow fire season, it's going to be a slow year for you. So we've really, that number has really dropped off. We still really rely on those crews, and we'd like to have more, but that's something we're working on. And DOF, Division of Forestry, we have, because we're on the road system, we have engines. So each one of our area offices has generally Type 6 engines, which are, you got a small water tank on the back, and then compartments for tools. And there'll be anywhere from 2 to 4 people on an engine crew. And they respond, like I said, along the road system, and they'll be the first ones to respond to a fire or a hel attack, a helicopter with a load of firefighters on it. And they are based around the state. And we have about, as you see there, about 85 technicians split amongst our 7 area offices. So it's not a huge number of people, and that doesn't include our crews, but it's not a wildly large number. And the BLM Alaska Fire Service, they don't have engines because they don't deal with roaded networks. Their fires are not accessible by road. So they use helicopters typically to ferry firefighters out to fires in those areas. And these are all these technicians are seasonal employees. They'll come on in March and they'll work through September, and then they're off for the winter. So a big part of our workforce is seasonal. And it's the same for the BLM AFS. They have their crews. They don't have technicians. They have FSS, fuels people, and they're qualified like technicians at different levels. Our technicians are qualified at different levels. They might be a Tech 1, Tech 2, Tech 3, Tech 4. Training in the wildland firefighting landscape is huge. Everything is based on training and qualifications, and it takes years to get yourself up to a Tech 4 position, where you're going to be maybe a squad boss or an engine boss or a division supervisor. So there's never-ending training for these guys, for wildland firefighters. Every year, they spend the entire month of March and half of April sitting through training classes, hands-on, classroom, and that. So training is, because safety is so important, training is a massive undertaking. Our aviation fleet, the Division of Forestry owns 4 planes, 2 Aero Commanders, which are we use for detection, and lead planes to guide retardant tankers in for their retardant drops. And then we have a couple others, a Shrike 500 and a Beaver. The Shrike can do detection, and the Beaver is mainly a logistics aircraft. And we just did have a plane go down the other day out in western Alaska, in Antioch, and so we are down to 3 planes now, and we are working on getting a replacement for this season on that. Fortunately, the 4 people on board survived, seriously injured, but they are survived, they're recovering. And I've been here 6 years, and that's the first kind of any aviation accident that we've had. Each one of our areas has a, 6 of the 7 areas have helicopters on 90-day contracts for the season. And those are used mainly for initial attack. Areas can also contract, call when needed, aircraft or fixed wing and helicopters from vendors in Alaska and even the lower 48 if they're not available here. And as I said, helicopters are used mainly, they have buckets, as you'll see on this helicopter here. They can attach a bucket to them and dip water out of ponds, rivers, and lakes, and to drop on fires. Those buckets hold typically around 300 gallons of water. So you don't want to be standing under one when they drop it. But they're also used for transporting firefighters and logistical missions to haul supplies in and out of fires. I tell people we use helicopters up here like they use pickup trucks in the lower 48. That's how we get people around, that's how we get gear around, and it adds to the risk. Anytime you put a helicopter in the air, there's a risk involved with that, but the same is true for driving a vehicle. We use helicopters a lot up here. Air tankers, we have 2 air tankers on contract with Conair Group Incorporated in Abbotsford, BC. These are older tankers, but they're perfect for up here because they're fast. They can hold a good amount of retardant or water, and they're much cheaper than your next generation jet tankers, which are being used more commonly in the lower 48. And these are also contracts, and these contracts for the tankers usually typically start in the first week or 2 of May. One is based in Palmer, one is based in Fairbanks at Fort Wainwright, and they can hold up to 3,000 gallons of water retardant. And typically it's retardant because we'll use helicopters to drop water on fires. But if there's a fire in a national refuge, say, they do not want retardant dropped on their land, so we would drop water there, but we would not drop retardant. So that's what I talk about working with landowners and for things like that. And also, our helicopters typically come on a little bit before our tankers, so they'll come on in late April in the first couple weeks of May, depending where they're at. They can't dip out of water until it's thawed out, so we have to wait for ponds and lakes to thaw before we can do that. And last year we did bring up other additional tankers that we contracted with. I think we had 6 or 7 tankers up here at one point because it was such a busy year. And then the BLM Alaska Fire Service, they have water scooping aircraft for water scoopers, which are smaller than your tankers. I think they can hold, I'm guessing here, but I think like 800 gallons of water, and they can actually scoop it up off the, they don't have to stop. They land on a lake or a pond. You know, it has to be a decent sized lake for them to land, so they get enough for landing and takeoff. And some of them carry water in their floats, which are what they're using here for the last few years, called fire bosses. And they scoop up the water in their floats and take off again without stopping, and then will deliver that water to a fire. And the other ones will skim water off their belly and fill up, they're called CL215s and CL415s. And we haven't had those up here for a couple of years, but water scoopers are very effective up here because we have so much water, so many water bodies to dip from and to scoop from. So those are a big asset, but those are a BLM Alaska Fire Service resource. That said, because I said it is an interagency deal up here, we share resources. So if we have a fire on state protection area and we need water scoopers, we will put in an order for those water scoopers, and if they're available, they will send them to our fire. And likewise, if there's an AFS fire in their protection area and they need a tanker, they just put an order in for that tanker, and that tanker would go delivered to them. And these tankers, there is a little bit of a misconception that red stuff that is being dropped out of that tanker that's retardant, and it's basically fertilizer with some other stuff mixed in, and they're not dropping that right on the fire. They're dropping that on the edges of the fire, around the perimeter of the fire, because it's just like the name applies, it's a retardant. So when the fire hits that line of retardant, it slows it down. It doesn't stop it, but it slows it down considerably, and it takes a much longer time for that fire to chunk through that than it would water, which would evaporate quickly. And so what a lot of times they'll do is depending where a fire is burning, and the size of the fire, they'll ring the whole fire with retardant and to get a containment line around it, and then that gives the people on the ground a chance to get in there and take advantage of that and work direct on the fire. But it's not designed to put a fire out. It's designed to retard the spread of the fire, and that's what they're used for. And your helicopters are dropping water right on the fire. So if there's a fire that's approaching some houses, they may put a retardant line right along that edge of that fire to slow that down, and then they can bring troops in and start working that edge of the fire and taking some direct action on it. And we do have 4 retardant bases spread around Alaska. One at Fort Wainwright, that's the largest one. And then also one out in McGrath, one in Kenai, one at Palmer, and one in Tanacross down by Tok. And so depending on where a fire is, they'll deploy a tanker, say based out of Fairbanks or based out of Palmer. And if there's a fire down near Tok, they can just reload at Tok and don't have to go all the way back to Palmer or Fairbanks. And it makes it much more effective, especially when you get out into rural Alaska, southwest Alaska, out near McGrath. If they had to come all the way back to Palmer or Fairbanks for a retardant drop every time, it would be a really time-consuming process and not nearly as effective. And we are in the process of setting up sort of a turnkey tanker base at Fairbanks International Airport, so that if anything did happen where they, like say a pandemic, happened and they closed Fort Wainwright down, we would have an alternative site because that is a big concern. And being on a military base is you don't know what's going to happen from day to day depending on the world situation. So we decided that it would probably be good to have a reserve tanker base, and Fairbanks International, we leased land from them, and they were kind enough to help us out. And so that is a work in progress, and it should be, I'm told, probably ready to go by the end of this week. We have 2 fire warehouses. That picture is of 2015, and that's fire hose that all came back, that was used on fires, and they bring it back to the warehouse and they refurb it, clean it, dry it, re-roll it, and it was a mountain of hose, because that year we issued more than 450 miles of hose, and that was just Division of Forestry. Between AFS and DOF, I think we distributed more than 800 miles of hose, so you could basically from Barrow to Valdez. But we have 2 warehouses for the Division of Forestry, one in Fairbanks and one in Palmer, that we use to resupply our area offices and to supply fires when they happen and they need supplies. They will put in orders to the warehouse, whether it's for hoses, pumps, chainsaws, toilet paper, coffee, food, your MREs, everything that you can think of, cooking kits, everything you need, you're going to get out of the warehouses. And the Alaska Fire Service has one on Fort Wainwright, a huge warehouse. It's one of a handful of caches in the United States. So they have a huge supply. And if we don't have something, we'll ask for them. And if they don't have something, they'll ask from us. And so it works great. And we are constantly being resupplied from the lower 48 if we are running low on anything there. But the warehouse, a lot of people think in terms of wildland firefighting, they just think of the firefighters in their red and green or yellow and green outfits and their hard hats, and there's much more that goes into it than that. You have all the support personnel, from financial people keeping track of costs to the warehouses that are supplying the gear and the outfitting the crews, to people like myself, public information officers who are giving information to the public so they can keep informed about what's going on and make decisions based on their safety and their properties. But there's a huge number of personnel that go into firefighting other than just the firefighters, and the warehouse is one of those places. These guys, they could not get all that hose rolled by the end of the summer. They had to come back and finish it the next year. There was just so much of it. So what are the challenges that we face, and this is not just in Alaska, this is the same in the lower 48. There's more and more people moving into what we call the wildland urban interface, WUI. People want to live in the woods. People want to live, have a place in the country or in the woods. And so when you're doing that, we're seeing more places built in the wildland urban interfaces where wildland fire can, get into populated areas because that population is spreading out and expanding. Land ownership changes, constant, and then like I said, we are working for landowners, so you're always dealing with different turnover in that regard. Human caused fires are always an issue. We do our best. We have a really robust prevention program at each one of our area offices, but we still get all sorts of different human caused fires. It's amazing the number of ways that I never imagined the number of ways fires could start. Whether it's putting a hot chainsaw down on some dry grass, somebody welding and a spark coming off from a welder, tossing a cigarette butt out the window. We had one in Delta this year where somebody burned some popcorn and threw it out into the yard, and the burned popcorn caught the grass on fire and started a grass fire. A lot of times, if it's that dry, especially early in the season, we typically have 2 fire seasons here. One is early on in April and May, where it hasn't greened up yet, and it's all human-caused fires, and it's all grass fires because the grass is dead, dry, very susceptible to ignition. And then just recently, as we're finding out the last few days, lightning is the other season where lightning comes into play. And that's typically at the end of May or early June. And like clockwork this year, I think last weekend we had our first real bust of lightning fires, and we've had 20, 30 fires started in the last few days from lightning, and we can get thousands of lightning strikes in a day. We can get 10, 15,000 lightning strikes in a day, which are all recorded at the Alaska Interagency Coordination Center. They have a lightning detection system, so we can see where the lightning is hitting. We will put up detection flights to look for fires that are started through that lightning, and you can go back and look if you see. And a lot of times these lightning caused fires don't pop up for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days or week or even longer. A lightning strike will hit. It'll start something smoldering, and then on the right conditions, when it gets hot, dry, and windy, that fire will fan to life, and you'll see smoke, and you've got a fire on the landscape that maybe has been sitting there for several days and just decided to poke its head up. But And then, huge number of values at risk. Like I said, they could be a cabin that somebody has out in the woods on a lake, on a river. They could be a power line. They could be a road. They could be a native allotment, just a huge archaeological sites, that we want to protect. So there's a huge number of things that are risks out there that we want to protect. Changes in policies and priorities. We're dealing with a lot of different agencies, and they aren't all on the same page all the time. So they maybe have, in national parks, they tend to want to let fires burn because it's part of the natural landscape. And obviously on the outskirts of Fairbanks, that's not the same thing. So you're always dealing with different policies and priorities. Budget cuts are always a challenge because firefighting is very expensive. We've probably spent between $200 and $300 million last year in Alaska on wildfire suppression and management, and it's very costly. Even when you have a slow fire season, you still spend a tremendous amount of money because you have to go through all the training and preparedness to be ready if you do have a big fire season. And what I always tell people is we are preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. And preparing for the worst is expensive. And when the worst does happen, it's even more expensive. And then lastly, some resources for folks if you're looking for fire information. A big one is akfireinfo.com. It's a WordPress interagency blog where we post updates on fires. If we have new fires start, we will post that there. We'll post pictures. We'll post updates on those fires. But that's where most of our information goes to, and that automatically populates both the Division of Forestry and BLM Alaska Fire Service Facebook pages and Twitter sites. So you can go on to akfireinfo.com and subscribe to it. So anytime there is an update, you'll get an email notifying you that something was just posted there, and you can go check it out. But the days of issuing press releases and that slow method of communication is sort of out the window. And now with social media, everything is real time. I mean, people are posting pictures of fires before we even get to them because they're there and we're not. And everybody's got a phone and everybody's got a camera. And so everything is real time. So we're trying to get information out to the public as quickly as possible because, they want to know what's going on. They want to know if they're going to have to prepare to move their horses or their dog teams or something like that. That's a huge endeavor and not something you can just snap your fingers and do. So we're trying to get information out to them on a timely and consistent basis and accurate information because, as you know, with social media, not everything you read on Facebook is true, believe it or not, and or the internet. So we're trying to be the source of information for the public to go to rely on, to get updated and timely information. And then obviously agency websites, Division of Forestry, BLM Alaska Fire Service, or the Alaska Interagency Coordination Center. You can go onto the AICC webpage and you can get a daily report of fire activity in Alaska, what new fires were discovered, what has been done on the fires that are being staffed, what fires are being monitored, how many fires have been to date in the state, how many acres have burned. There's a tremendous amount of information on that page, and I would encourage people to go look at it. And obviously, this would normally be the time where I'd ask for questions, and I know there'd be all sorts of hands shooting up, but in this COVID-19 environment, that is not the case. And so I'll just pop a few questions out that I'm sure people would have asked. So one of the questions I always get is, what's fire season going to be like this year? And I always tell them, if I could predict what fire season was going to be like, or if we could, it would make our jobs a lot easier. But that really is dependent on Mother Nature and what kind of weather she throws at us in really May and June, which is really the bulk of our fire season. Another question I'm sure people have on their minds, given the current environment that we're in, is how COVID-19 is impacting wildland fire management. And it has been a huge challenge, that started back in March, when all our workforce was just coming back to work, is when this thing broke in Alaska and around much of the country. And it's been a daily struggle. I mean, things change every day. Initially, like I said, a lot of our firefighters are seasonal employees, and so they're coming back from exotic places where they've traveled all winter, and they've got to stay here. They get here and they've got to quarantine for 14 days before they can even go to work. They've got to, and a big question early in the season was, what impact this was going to have on bringing resources from the lower 48 up to Alaska with the travel restrictions and quarantine requirements, and which is one of the reasons we instituted a statewide burn permit suspension on May 1st, because we did not, we were uncertain about whether we were be able to get help from the lower 48, and that's still a question. We've been working with the Department of Health and Social Services. We've got a plan in place to test firefighters. The state does, to test firefighters when they come into the state. So they will come in, they get tested, then they go to a hotel to quarantine. They'll be tested right at the airport. They'll go to quarantine until their test results are back. If their test results are back negative, then they can go to work and then follow the CDC guidelines for social distancing, wearing masks, proper, hand sanitation and all that. But to be honest, it's been a huge challenge. I mean, we're talking about trying to figure out how ways to disinfect engines and helicopters that our firefighters ride in on a daily basis to try to prevent the spread of this. You're talking about 20-person crews who are like family units that work really closely together, and asking them to social distance and wear masks. And wearing masks when you're on a fire line in a wildland fire situation is not practical. You can't do it. It has all kinds of ramifications, from hydration to eating to just heat to breathing. And so we're doing what we can to keep our firefighters safe and trying to take all the precautions necessary. But it has been and continues to be a huge challenge. And we're seeing that more every day. We've got a whole team set up to deal with COVID issues and protocols, and I think Alaska did well. I think we're out ahead of a lot of the other areas in just the protocols and best management practices that we came up with. But it has been and will continue to be a massive challenge, and hopefully that we can get through, because if one person is infected at a station or on a crew, that pretty much takes that whole station and crew out of the picture until we can make sure that everybody's safe and is not infected. So it could have, and if you see how fire camps are set up, you can have 500-600 people in a camp, and that is not, the way we want things. So we're doing everything from thinking up of ways to create smaller camps, keep people separated, not have caterers. Maybe people are going to be eating more MREs this year, but just trying to figure out how to keep COVID out of the firefighting environment and not put our firefighters at risk, which is one of the reasons we put that burn permit suspension in, was to reduce human-caused fires, because going out to respond to a fire in the Goldstream Valley that was started because somebody was burning brush when they shouldn't be, puts our firefighters at risk. It puts the public at risk. If somebody has COVID and they don't know it, and you're exposing the public or your firefighters to that. So it's a huge consideration, and I think it's like everything else that you're going to see in life. I think this is going to change firefighting in some ways well down the road after this is all settled, just because we're looking at different management practices, some of which will probably be useful down the road. And that's about it that I have, and I wish I could be talking to you in person, but that's just not the way it is in this day right now. But hopefully things will be better, and we can see each other next year.